In the shadowed corridors of power, where loyalty is currency and betrayal costs lives, one man's refusal to unlock a door would ignite a rebellion that would shake the very foundations of the British crown. This is not a tale of kings and queens, but of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, where a simple guard's conscience becomes the catalyst for a political storm that threatens to tear apart centuries of tradition.
When Thomas Mackenzie, a humble vault guardian at the Royal Treasury, receives an order that contradicts everything he believes in, his silent defiance sets in motion events that will force him to choose between duty to his superiors and loyalty to his principles. In a world where following orders without question is the only way to survive, what happens when a man decides that some commands are too dangerous to obey? Thomas Mackenzie had always believed that his job was simple: guard the vault, check the credentials, follow the protocol. For 15 years he had done exactly that, never questioning the orders that came from above, never wondering about the contents of the massive steel chamber that lay behind the reinforced doors he protected. The Royal Treasury vault beneath Edinburgh Castle was a place of whispers and shadows, where few dared to tread and fewer still were permitted to enter. On that cold February morning in 2024, Thomas arrived at his post, as he had every day for the past decade and a half. The ancient stones of Edinburgh Castle seemed to hold their breath in the early morning mist, and the narrow corridor leading to the vault felt more oppressive than usual. He had no way of knowing that this would be the day his world would change forever. Thomas was not a man who stood out in a crowd. At 43, he had the unremarkable appearance of someone who had spent most of his life following orders without question. His brown hair was beginning to show streaks of gray at the temples, and his face bore the lines of a man who had learned to keep his thoughts to himself. He was neither tall nor short, neither handsome nor plain, but possessed the kind of steady reliability that made him perfect for his role as a guardian of secrets. His morning routine was as predictable as clockwork. He would arrive at precisely 7:30, check in with the night guard, review the security logs, and settle into his position at the desk that faced the vault entrance. The massive door behind him was a marvel of engineering, with locks that required not one but 3 separate keys to open, each held by different officials who rarely appeared at the same time. That morning, however, something felt different. The night guard, usually chatty and eager to share gossip from his shift, seemed nervous and distracted. He handed over the logbook without his usual commentary about the weather or complaints about his wife's cooking. Thomas noticed the man's hands shaking slightly as he gathered his belongings. "Everything all right, Duncan?" Thomas asked, though he wasn't really expecting an honest answer. In their line of work, everything was always officially all right, regardless of the reality. Duncan paused at the door, his hand on the handle. For a moment, Thomas thought he might actually say something meaningful, but then the older man simply nodded and disappeared into the corridor beyond. Thomas was left alone with a growing sense of unease that he couldn't quite explain. The morning passed quietly, as most mornings did. Thomas reviewed the security protocols, checked the surveillance monitors, and completed his routine paperwork. The vault behind him remained sealed and silent, as it had been for months. It was unusual for so much time to pass without any authorized access, but Thomas had learned not to question such things. His job was to guard, not to wonder. It was just after noon when the footsteps echoed down the corridor. Thomas looked up from his lunch to see a figure approaching, silhouetted against the dim lighting of the passageway. As the person drew closer, Thomas recognized the distinctive uniform of a royal courier. These men and women were the messengers of the highest levels of government, carrying orders that could not be trusted to phones or emails. The courier was young, perhaps in his late 20s, with the kind of crisp efficiency that came from military training. He approached Thomas's desk with purposeful strides, his leather satchel held securely at his side. Without preamble, he produced an envelope bearing the seal of the Duke of Rothesay. "Thomas Mackenzie?" the courier asked, though he clearly already knew the answer. "Yes, sir. I have orders for you from His Royal Highness, the Duke of Rothesay. You are to read these instructions immediately and comply without delay." Thomas took the envelope with steady hands, though his heart had begun to beat faster. Direct orders from the Duke of Rothesay were rare, and they usually meant that something significant was happening in the corridors of power far above his pay grade. He broke the wax seal and unfolded the heavy paper inside. The orders were typed on official letterhead, with the Duke's personal signature at the bottom. But as Thomas read the words, his sense of unease transformed into something approaching alarm. The document instructed him to provide immediate access to the Royal Treasury Vault to a team of specialists who would arrive that afternoon. More concerning still, the order specifically stated that this access was to be granted without the usual protocol requiring all 3 key holders to be present. Thomas read the document 3 times, hoping he had misunderstood something. But the instructions were clear. He was being asked to bypass the security measures that had been in place for decades, measures that existed specifically to prevent unauthorized access to one of the most secure locations in the United Kingdom. "Sir," Thomas said to the courier, who had been waiting patiently for a response, "these orders seem to contradict our standard security protocol. I'm not authorized to grant vault access without all 3 key holders present. This is the book, it's about history. These orders seem to contradict our standard security protocol. I'm not authorized to grant vault access without all 3 key holders present." The courier's expression didn't change. "Your concerns are noted, Mr. Dellick." Mackenzie, however, these orders come directly from the Duke of Rothesay and are to be followed precisely as written. "The specialists will arrive at 3 o'clock this afternoon. You will grant them access." With that, the courier turned and walked back down the corridor, his footsteps echoing in the silence until they faded completely. Thomas was left alone with the document in his hands and a growing certainty that something was very wrong. He had never met the Duke of Rothesay personally, but he knew enough about the royal hierarchy to understand that such orders carry tremendous weight. The Duke of Rothesay was the heir apparent to the throne, and his commands were not to be taken lightly. Yet the very nature of these orders seemed to go against everything Thomas had been trained to do. The security protocols for the Royal Treasury Vault had been developed over many years, refined through experience and designed to prevent exactly the kind of unauthorized access these orders seemed to demand. The requirement for 3 key holders to be present simultaneously wasn't arbitrary bureaucracy. It was a safeguard against corruption, coercion, or abuse of power. No single person, no matter how highly placed, was supposed to be able to access the vault alone. Thomas spent the next hour reviewing the security manual, searching for any provision that might allow him to follow these orders within the bounds of proper protocol. But the more he read, the more convinced he became that what he was being asked to do was not just unusual, it was potentially dangerous. The vault contained more than just gold and jewels. Thomas didn't know all the details, but he knew that certain state documents were stored there, along with items of historical significance that were considered too valuable or sensitive to be housed anywhere else. The security measures existed not just to protect these items from theft, but to ensure that access to them could never be manipulated by any single individual or faction. As 2 o'clock approached, Thomas found himself facing a choice he had never expected to confront. He could follow the orders from the Duke of Rothesay, bypass the security protocols, and allow the specialists access to the vault. Or he could refuse, knowing that such defiance would almost certainly end his career and possibly result in serious legal consequences. He thought about his wife, Margaret, who had always supported his steady government job despite the modest pay and long hours. He thought about his daughter, Sarah, who was in her final year of university and counting on his continued employment to help pay her expenses. He thought about the mortgage on their small house and the pension he would lose if he was dismissed for insubordination. But he also thought about the oath he had taken when he first accepted his position. He had sworn to protect the assets under his care and to follow all security protocols without exception. That oath hadn't mentioned anything about exceptions for members of the royal family or anyone else. It had been absolute and unconditional. At 2:30, Thomas made his decision. He reached for the secure telephone on his desk and dialed the number for the Treasury Security Office. When the duty officer answered, Thomas explained the situation as clearly and calmly as he could. "I've received orders from the Duke of Rothesay to grant vault access without following standard protocol," he said. "I need clarification on whether these orders supersede our security requirements." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When the duty officer finally responded, his voice was carefully neutral. "Mr. Mackenzie, I need you to repeat exactly what you just told me." Thomas repeated his explanation, reading portions of the orders verbatim. Another pause followed, longer this time. "Mr. Mackenzie, I'm going to need you to fax a copy of those orders to this office immediately. Do not grant access to anyone until you receive further instructions from us. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir, perfectly." Thomas sent the fax and settled in to wait. At exactly 3 o'clock, he heard footsteps in the corridor again. This time, there were several people approaching. A team of 4 individuals appeared at his desk, led by a woman in an expensive suit who carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted.
"Mr. Mackenzie, I'm Jennifer Whitman from the Cabinet Office."
"We're here to access the vault on the authority of the Duke of Rothesay. I trust you received the appropriate orders." Thomas looked at the group before him. In addition to Miss Whitman, there were 2 men in dark suits who had the unmistakable bearing of security personnel, and a third man carrying what appeared to be some kind of electronic equipment. None of them displayed any official identification beyond Miss Kana Judge. Whitman's brief introduction. "I did receive orders, ma'am," Thomas replied carefully. "However, I've been instructed by the Treasury Security Office to wait for clarification before proceeding. The order seemed to contradict our standard security protocols." Ms. Whitman's expression hardened. Mr. Mackenzie, those orders come from the heir to the throne. They supersede any concerns you might have about protocol.
I need you to open that vault immediately. I understand your position, ma'am, but I have my instructions. I need to wait for clearance from the Treasury Security Office before I can grant access. The two security men stepped forward slightly, and Thomas felt his pulse quicken, but he remained seated at his desk, his hands folded calmly in front of him, projecting a composure he didn't entirely feel. Mr. Mackenzie, Ms. Whitman said, her voice taking on a more threatening tone. I don't think you understand the gravity of this situation. These orders come from the very highest levels of government. Your refusal to comply constitutes insubordination at best and treason at worst. Thomas had never been called a traitor before. The word hung in the air between them like a physical presence. He thought about how that word would sound in the newspapers, how it would feel to hear his neighbors whisper it behind his back. But he also thought about the oath he had taken, and the protocols that existed for good reason. Ma'am, I'm not refusing to comply with legitimate orders. I'm following the proper procedure to verify that these orders are consistent with our security requirements. I'm sure you understand that the safety of the materials in this vault is a matter of national importance. Ms. Whitman stared at him for a long moment, her frustration evident. Then she turned to one of the men beside her and spoke in a voice too low for Thomas to hear. The man nodded and pulled out a mobile phone, walking a few steps away to make a call. While they waited, Thomas found himself studying the group before him more carefully. There was something about their manner that didn't sit right with him. They had the appearance of official government personnel, but their behavior seemed more aggressive than he would have expected from people who were simply following routine orders. Miss Whitman, in particular, seemed anxious in a way that suggested this was not a routine operation. The man with the phone returned and whispered something to Miss
Whitman. Her expression grew even more serious. Mr. Mackenzie, I'm going to give you one final opportunity to reconsider your position.
Open the vault now. We can all pretend this unfortunate misunderstanding never happened. Continue to refuse, and you will face the full consequences of defying a direct royal command.
Thomas looked at each of the four people standing before him, then at the sealed vault door behind his desk. In that moment, he realized that his quiet life as a dutiful government employee was over, regardless of what choice he made. If he opened the vault without proper authorization, he would be violating his oath and potentially compromising national security. If he refused, he would be branded a traitor and likely face prosecution.
But as he sat there, weighing his options, Thomas realized that the choice wasn't really about his career or his future. It was about the principle that had guided him throughout his 15 years of service. That some things were more important than convenience, more important than orders from above, and more important than his own personal comfort.
Ma'am, I appreciate the position you're in, he said finally. But I cannot grant access to this vault without proper authorization through established channels. I suggest you contact the Treasury Security Office directly to resolve any questions about protocol. The silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever. Miss Whitman's face had gone pale with anger, and the two security men looked as if they were preparing to take more direct action. But before anyone could speak, the sound of additional footsteps echoed from the corridor. Two uniformed security officers from the Treasury Security Office appeared at the entrance to the chamber. The lead officer, a man Thomas recognized as Sergeant Williams, surveyed the scene before him with professional calm. Miss Whitman, I'm going to have to ask you and your team to step away from the vault area while we sort out this authorization issue, Sergeant Williams said. His tone was polite but firm, and Thomas noticed that his hand rested casually on the radio at his belt. Miss Whitman looked as if she wanted to argue, but something in Sergeant Williams's manner seemed to convince her that this was not a battle she could win at the moment. With obvious reluctance, she gestured for her team to follow her as they moved away from Thomas's desk. This isn't over, Mr. Desk. Mackenzie, she said as she passed. You have no idea what you've just done. As the group disappeared down the corridor, Sergeant Williams approached Thomas's desk. You did the right thing, lad, he said quietly, but I have a feeling this is just the beginning of your troubles. Thomas nodded, understanding that his simple refusal to open a door had set in motion events that would have consequences far beyond anything he could have imagined. As he sat alone at his desk once again, the weight of the sealed vault door behind him seemed heavier than ever before. The following morning brought with it a fog that seemed to seep through the ancient stones of Edinburgh Castle, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty that matched Thomas Mackenzie's state of mind perfectly. He had spent a sleepless night replaying the events of the previous day, wondering if he had made the right choice and dreading what consequences might await him. Margaret had noticed his distraction during dinner, but Thomas had been unable to explain what was troubling him. The nature of his work meant that he couldn't share details about what happened at the vault even with his wife. She had learned over the years not to ask too many questions about his job, understanding that some things were better left unspoken. But she could see the worry in his eyes, and her own anxiety had grown in response. "Whatever it is, Thomas," she had said as they prepared for bed, "you did what you thought was right. That's all anyone can do." Her words had provided some comfort, but they couldn't erase the gnawing uncertainty about what the new day would bring.
As Thomas made his way through the security checkpoints leading to his post, he noticed that several of his colleagues avoided making eye contact. Word traveled fast in the small world of government security, and it was clear that news of yesterday's confrontation had already spread.
When Thomas reached his desk, he found Chief Inspector Harold Morrison waiting for him. Morrison was a career civil servant with nearly 30 years of experience in government security, and his presence at the vault entrance could only mean that serious discussions were taking place at levels far above Thomas's usual purview.
"Mackenzie," Morrison said with a nod. "We need to talk." Morrison was a man who commanded respect without demanding it. He had the kind of quiet authority that came from years of handling delicate situations with discretion and professionalism. Thomas had always liked him, though their interactions had been limited to occasional security briefings and annual evaluations. "Yes, sir. Let's walk," Morrison said, gesturing toward the corridor. As they moved away from the vault area, Morrison spoke in a voice low enough to avoid any potential surveillance devices. "You've stirred up quite a hornet's nest, lad. Orders came down this morning to suspend you, pending a full investigation."
Thomas felt his stomach drop, though he had been expecting something like this. "I understand, sir. Do you?" Morrison stopped walking and turned to face him.
"Because I'm not sure you do. The people you refused yesterday aren't the kind who accept no gracefully. They're pressing for charges of insubordination, possibly treason. They want your head on a platter." The word treason hit Thomas like a physical blow. Yesterday, Ms. Whitman had used it as a threat. Today, it seemed to be moving toward reality. "But here's the thing," Morrison continued. "The more we look into this situation, the more questions we have about those orders you received. The Duke of Rothesay's office claims to have no knowledge of any directive to access the vault. According to his private secretary, the Duke was attending a charity function in Glasgow all day yesterday and couldn't have issued such orders." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning fog. "Sir, are you saying the orders were fake?"
"I'm saying we don't know what to believe yet."
"The documents appear authentic, but the chain of custody is unclear. We're conducting a full investigation, but these things take time. In the meantime, you're caught in the middle of what appears to be a very serious security breach." Morrison resumed walking, and Thomas fell into step beside him. They moved through corridors that Thomas knew intimately, but which suddenly felt foreign and threatening. "There's something else you need to know," Morrison said. "Miss Whitman and her team have been identified. They're not Cabinet Office personnel as she claimed. According to our preliminary investigation, she's a private contractor with connections to several international security firms. The men with her have similar backgrounds." The implications of this revelation began to sink in. If the orders were fake and the people demanding access to the vault were not legitimate government personnel, then Thomas's refusal had potentially prevented a serious security breach. But that realization brought with it a new set of concerns. Who were they working for? Thomas asked. "That's what we're trying to find out." But given the sophistication of the forged documents and the level of inside knowledge they seemed to possess, this wasn't some random criminal enterprise. Someone with significant resources and high-level connections orchestrated this operation. They had reached a small office near the main security center, and Morrison gestured for Thomas to enter. The room was spartanly furnished with a desk, 2 chairs, and a filing cabinet.
Morrison closed the door and activated a small device that Thomas recognized as an electronic countermeasures unit designed to prevent eavesdropping. "Thomas, I want you to understand the position you're in," Morrison said as they both sat down.
"Officially, you're suspended pending investigation. Unofficially, you may have prevented a major security breach that could have compromised national interests. The problem is that we don't yet know who was behind this attempt, or how high their connections reach." Thomas felt overwhelmed by the scope of what Morrison was describing. Yesterday he had been a simple vault guard. Today he was apparently caught up in what sounded like a conspiracy involving forged royal documents and mysterious private contractors. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we try to figure out who wanted access to that vault and why." "The items stored there are sensitive enough that foreign governments, criminal organizations, or even rogue elements within our own government might have reasons to want them. Your job is to stay safe and keep quiet while we investigate." Morrison leaned forward, his expression serious.
Thomas, I need you to understand that your life may be in danger. The people who went to this much trouble to gain access to the vault aren't going to simply give up because their first attempt failed.
They may try to pressure you directly, or they may try to eliminate you as a witness to their activities. The idea that his life might be in danger seemed surreal to Thomas.
He was a middle-aged government employee who lived a quiet suburban life. The most dangerous thing he had ever done was change a flat tire on a busy highway. Now he was being told that powerful people might want to kill him because he had refused to open a door. I've arranged for protective surveillance. Morrison continued.
You won't see them, but there will be people watching your house and following you when you leave. I've also arranged for your wife and daughter to be monitored discreetly.
We can't take any chances. Thomas thought about Margaret and Sarah, going about their daily routines, with no idea that their lives had suddenly become complicated and potentially dangerous.
He felt a surge of anger at the people who would put his family at risk with their deception. Sir, what exactly is in that vault that would be worth all this trouble? Thomas asked.
Morrison was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh how much he should reveal. I can't give you all the details, but I can tell you that the vault contains more than just financial assets.
There are historical documents, diplomatic correspondence, and other materials that could be extremely valuable to the wrong people. Some of these items could potentially destabilize international relationships if they fell into hostile hands.
The weight of responsibility Thomas felt was overwhelming. His simple adherence to protocol had apparently prevented materials vital to national security from being compromised.
But it had also made him a target for people with the resources and determination to forge royal documents and infiltrate high-security facilities. There's one more thing, Morrison said.
We've been monitoring communications related to this incident, and there's evidence that some people in high places may have been involved in planning this operation. We don't know who yet, but the scope of inside knowledge required suggests that the conspiracy reaches into levels of government that should have been above suspicion.
This revelation shook Thomas more than anything else Morrison had said. The idea that elements within the government itself might be involved in attempting to breach the vault made him question everything he had believed about his work and his purpose.
As if reading his thoughts, Morrison continued. This is why your adherence to protocol was so important, Thomas. The safeguards exist not just to prevent external threats, but to protect against corruption from within. Your refusal to compromise those safeguards may have exposed a conspiracy that could have done immense damage to national security.
Morrison stood up and deactivated the countermeasures device. For now, you're to go home and stay there.
Don't talk to anyone about what happened. Don't answer questions from reporters, and be very careful about who you trust. We'll be in contact as the investigation progresses. As Thomas prepared to leave, Morrison placed a hand on his shoulder. Thomas, I know this is frightening and confusing, but I want you to know that you did the right thing. Your integrity and commitment to protocol may have saved us from a disaster we're only beginning to understand. The journey home seemed longer than usual despite the protective surveillance that Morrison had arranged. Thomas found himself looking over his shoulder and studying the faces of strangers, wondering if any of them might be connected to the conspiracy he had inadvertently uncovered. When he reached his house, Margaret was waiting for him with obvious concern. She had received a call from his supervisor explaining that Thomas was taking emergency leave due to a security matter, but she had been given no details about what was happening. Thomas, what's going on? She asked as soon as he walked through the door. First you come home yesterday looking like you've seen a ghost, and now I get a call saying you're on emergency leave for security reasons. What kind of trouble are you in? Thomas sat down at their kitchen table, the familiar surroundings providing some comfort in the midst of so much uncertainty. He wanted to tell Margaret everything, to share the burden of what he was carrying, but he knew that knowledge would only put her in more danger. I can't give you all the details, he said carefully. But I refused to follow an order that I believed violated security protocol. It turns out I was right to refuse, but the situation is more complicated than anyone initially realized. Margaret studied his face, reading the worry and fear he was trying to hide. Are we in danger, Thomas? The question hung between them, and Thomas realized he couldn't lie to her about something so important. It's possible. There are people watching the house to make sure we're safe, but you need to be careful. Don't talk to anyone you don't know, don't go anywhere alone if you can help it, and call me immediately if anything seems unusual. Margaret's face went pale, but she nodded with the kind of steady determination that had attracted Thomas to her 20 years earlier. What about Sarah? Should we call her home from university? Thomas had been wrestling with the same question. His daughter was in her final semester at the University of St. Andrews, just a few hours away. Part of him wanted to bring her home where he could protect her, but another part recognized that drawing attention to her might actually make her less safe. Not yet, he decided.
But I'm going to arrange for someone to keep an eye on her without her knowing about it. The less she knows about this situation, the safer she'll be.
That evening, as Thomas and Margaret sat in their living room trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, the phone rang. Thomas hesitated before answering, wondering if it might be another attempt by the mysterious forces behind yesterday's events to pressure him. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but spoke with the kind of crisp authority that suggested official business.
Mr. Mackenzie, this is Deputy Assistant Secretary James Crawford from the Cabinet Office.
I need to speak with you about yesterday's incident at the vault. Thomas felt his pulse quicken.
After everything Morrison had told him about the investigation, he was suspicious of anyone claiming government authority without proper introduction. Sir, I've been instructed not to discuss this matter with anyone without clearance from Chief Inspector Morrison. Thomas replied, Mr. Mackenzie, I understand your caution, but time is of the essence. We have reason to believe that another attempt to access the vault may be planned, and we need your cooperation to prevent it. The caller's urgency seemed genuine, but Thomas remembered Morrison's warnings about trusting anyone without verification. Sir, I'd be happy to cooperate, but I need to verify your identity through proper channels first. Can you provide me with a contact number that I can verify through the Cabinet Office directory?
There was a pause, and then the caller's tone became more insistent.
Mr. Mackenzie, I don't think you understand the gravity of the situation. Lives may be at stake.
I need you to meet with me tonight so we can discuss additional security measures. Every instinct Thomas had developed during his years in government security was now screaming warnings.
The caller's insistence on immediate action and reluctance to submit to verification procedures were classic signs of deception. Sir, I'm going to have to decline. If this is a legitimate government matter, it can be handled through proper channels during normal business hours. Mackenzie, you're making a serious mistake. The people who attempted to access the vault yesterday are not finished with their plans. Your continued refusal to cooperate is putting yourself and your family at risk. The explicit threat chilled Thomas, but it also confirmed his suspicions about the caller's true identity. I'm ending this conversation now, he said, and hung up the phone. Margaret, who had been listening to Thomas's side of the conversation, looked at him with growing alarm. Who was that? I don't know, but I don't think it was anyone from the government, Thomas replied. He immediately called the number Morrison had given him for emergency contact. Morrison answered on the first ring as if he had been expecting the call. What's happened, Thomas? Thomas described the phone conversation in detail, and Morrison's response confirmed his suspicions. That wasn't anyone from our organization, and I doubt it was anyone from the legitimate government. They're trying to pressure you directly now that their official approach failed. The implications were frightening. The people behind the vault infiltration attempt now knew where Thomas lived and had his personal phone number. They were escalating their efforts to achieve whatever goal had motivated their original deception. Morrison, what do we do now? Thomas asked.
Now we prepare for the possibility that they might try more direct methods. The protective surveillance around your house is being increased, and we're expediting the investigation.
But Thomas, I need you to understand that this situation is becoming more dangerous by the hour. These people have shown they're willing to forge royal documents and impersonate government officials. There's no telling what they might try next. As Thomas hung up the phone, he realized that his simple act of refusing to open a vault door had drawn him into a conflict whose scope and danger were still expanding. The quiet life he had built with Margaret and Sarah was now under threat from forces he didn't understand and couldn't predict. Outside, the fog continued to swirl around their house, obscuring the watchers in the shadows and concealing whatever other dangers the night might bring. Thomas knew that the morning would bring new challenges and new revelations about the conspiracy he had unwittingly exposed. What he didn't know was that his refusal to compromise his principles had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately force him to choose between his own safety and his duty to protect secrets that could reshape the balance of power between nations. 3 days after the threatening phone call, Thomas Mackenzie was beginning to understand the true meaning of being trapped between opposing forces. The protective surveillance around his house had become more obvious as the threat level increased, with unmarked cars rotating shifts at the end of his street and unfamiliar faces appearing in the neighborhood at regular intervals. Meanwhile, the pressure from unknown enemies was intensifying in ways that made every ordinary activity feel dangerous. The investigation into the vault infiltration attempt was revealing connections that reached deeper into government circles than anyone had initially suspected. Morrison had called that morning with an update that left Thomas feeling more vulnerable than ever. "We've identified the source of the forged documents," Morrison had explained during their secure phone conversation. The paper, ink, and even the wax seal were authentic materials that could only have been obtained from within the royal household itself. Someone with direct access to the Duke of Rothesay's office created those orders. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a case of sophisticated criminals attempting to breach government security. It was evidence of betrayal at the highest levels of the British establishment, involving people with intimate knowledge of royal protocols and access to materials that should have been impossible to forge.
Sir, does this mean someone in the Duke's household is involved? Thomas had asked.
We're investigating every possibility, but it's more complicated than simple betrayal by a single individual. The operation required coordination between multiple people with different types of access and expertise. We're looking at a network that includes elements within the royal household, private security contractors, and possibly foreign intelligence services. As Thomas sat in his living room that afternoon, watching Margaret tend to her garden while covertly observing the protective agents positioned around their property, he tried to make sense of how his ordinary life had become entangled in international conspiracy. The vault he had guarded for 15 years contained secrets that apparently justified elaborate deception and the corruption of royal institutions. The sound of the telephone ringing interrupted his thoughts. Thomas approached the phone cautiously, having learned to treat every unexpected contact as potentially dangerous. The caller identification showed a number he didn't recognize, but Morrison had instructed him to answer all calls in case legitimate government officials needed to reach him. Thomas Mackenzie speaking.
Mackenzie, this is Director Elizabeth Hartwell from the Security Service. I need to meet with you immediately regarding the vault incident.
There have been new developments that require your direct input. Thomas had learned to be suspicious of anyone claiming authority, regardless of how official they sounded.
Ma'am, I need to verify your identity through Chief Inspector Morrison before I can meet with anyone. Mr. Mackenzie, I understand your caution, but Chief Inspector Morrison is currently unavailable.
He's been reassigned to another case due to security concerns about the vault investigation. I'm his replacement on this matter. A chill ran down Thomas's spine. Morrison had said nothing about being reassigned, and his last communication had been only hours earlier.
Either this caller was lying, or something had happened to Morrison that threatened the entire investigation. Ma'am, when was Inspector Morrison reassigned?
I spoke with him this morning and he mentioned no such change. There was a pause before the caller responded.
The reassignment was implemented this afternoon following the discovery of new intelligence about the scope of the conspiracy. Time is critical, Mr. Spire.
Mackenzie, we need to meet tonight to discuss protective measures for your family. The mention of his family sent a surge of fear through Thomas, but it also confirmed his suspicions about the caller's true identity. Legitimate government officials wouldn't use his family's safety as leverage to force an immediate meeting without proper verification procedures.
Ma'am, I'm going to have to decline this meeting until I can confirm the situation through proper channels.
Mackenzie, you're making a mistake that could have fatal consequences for everyone you care about. The people who attempted to access the vault have decided that you represent an unacceptable security risk.
They're planning to eliminate that risk permanently. The explicit threat was chilling, but Thomas forced himself to remain calm.
I understand your concerns, but I must follow proper protocol. There is no more time for protocol. The caller snapped, her composure finally cracking. They know where your daughter goes to school, Mr. Mackenzie. They know her class schedule, her favorite coffee shop, and the route she takes back to her dormitory every evening. How long do you think protocol will protect her? The specific details about Sarah's daily routine hit Thomas like physical blows. These people had been watching his daughter, learning her habits, and positioning themselves to threaten the person he cared about most in the world. The protective surveillance around his house meant nothing if they could reach Sarah in St. Andrews. "What do you want?" Thomas asked, his voice barely steady. "We want you to come with us tonight. We want you to tell us exactly what you observed during the vault incident, and we want you to provide us with certain information about vault security procedures. In return, your family will remain safe." Thomas realized he was being offered a choice between betraying his oath and protecting his daughter. The people behind this conspiracy had escalated from deception to direct threats against innocent family members. They had demonstrated sophisticated planning, high-level connections, and a willingness to corrupt royal institutions. Now they were making it clear that they would target his daughter if he continued to resist their demands. "I need time to consider your offer," Thomas said, trying to buy time to figure out how to contact Morrison or other legitimate authorities. "You have 1 hour, Mr. Mackenzie. Call back with instructions for the meeting location."
"And Mr. Cust, Mackenzie, don't try to contact anyone about this conversation.
"We'll know if you do, and Sarah will pay the price for your lack of cooperation." The line went dead, leaving Thomas staring at the phone with his heart pounding. The conspiracy had evolved from attempted theft to kidnapping and threats against his family. These weren't common criminals or even sophisticated foreign agents. They were people with the resources to monitor government communications,
track university students, and orchestrate complex operations involving forged royal documents.
Thomas's first instinct was to call Morrison immediately, but the caller's warning about monitoring his communications gave him pause.
If they really had the capability to intercept his phone calls, contacting Morrison might indeed put Sarah in immediate danger. He needed to find a way to get help without alerting the people who were threatening his family.
Margaret appeared in the living room doorway, having noticed his distress from the garden.
Thomas, what's wrong?
You look terrified. Thomas struggled with how much to tell her. She deserved to know that their daughter was in danger, but he also needed to protect her from information that could make her a target as well.
Margaret, I need you to do something without asking questions. I need you to go to the neighbor's house and call Sarah at university.
Tell her to go immediately to the campus security office and stay there until someone from the government comes to get her. Tell her it's a family emergency and she shouldn't return to her dormitory or follow her normal routine. Margaret's face went pale, but she nodded with the steady determination Thomas had come to rely on during their 20 years of marriage.
What about you? What's happening? I'm being forced to make a choice between betraying my oath and protecting our family.
I don't know yet how I'm going to resolve it, but I need to know that you and Sarah are safe while I figure it out. Margaret moved toward the door, then turned back.
Thomas, whatever these people want from you, don't give it to them. Sarah and I will be fine, but if you compromise your principles, you'll never forgive yourself.
We'll never forgive ourselves for being the reason you did it. Her words strengthened Thomas's resolve, even as they highlighted the impossible nature of his situation. His family was telling him to maintain his integrity even at the cost of their own safety, while unknown enemies were threatening to harm the people he loved most if he didn't betray everything he believed in. After Margaret left for the neighbor's house, Thomas sat alone in his living room, trying to develop a plan that would protect his family without compromising national security. The vault contained materials that could destabilize international relationships and compromise ongoing intelligence operations. Giving these people access to such sensitive information could have consequences far beyond his personal situation. But the thought of Sarah being harmed because of his adherence to protocol was almost unbearable. She was an innocent young woman whose only connection to this conspiracy was being his daughter. The people threatening her were using his love for her as a weapon against him, forcing him to choose between duty and family. As Thomas wrestled with this impossible choice, he heard the sound of a car door closing outside. Through the front window, he could see one of the protective surveillance agents approaching his house with obvious urgency. Something had changed in the security situation. The agent knocked on the door and identified himself as Detective Sergeant Collins from the Treasury Security Office. Thomas recognized the name from Morrison's briefings, but had never met the man personally.
Mr. Mackenzie, we've been monitoring communications related to your case and we intercepted a phone call to your house approximately 30 minutes ago.
We need to talk immediately about the threats that were made against your family. Thomas felt a mixture of relief and concern.
Relief that the protective surveillance team was aware of the threats, but concern about what their interception of the call might mean for Sarah's safety. Detective Sergeant, they said they would know if I contacted anyone about their call.
If you intercepted it, does that mean they know you're here? It's possible, but we're more concerned about the immediate threat to your daughter. We've already dispatched a team to the University of St. Andrews to provide protection, but we need to coordinate our response carefully to avoid escalating the situation.
Collins entered the house and immediately began checking windows and sightlines, his professional manner suggesting extensive experience with threat assessment. As he worked, he continued to brief Thomas on the developing situation.
The people making these threats have demonstrated sophisticated surveillance capabilities and access to high-level intelligence. Our preliminary assessment suggests they're backed by a foreign government that wants access to the materials in the vault for strategic purposes. This revelation added another layer of complexity to Thomas's situation. He wasn't just caught between criminals and law enforcement.
He was apparently caught between competing national interests, with his family being used as pawns in a larger geopolitical game.
Which government? Thomas asked.
We're still investigating, but the operational methods and resource requirements suggest one of the major powers with advanced intelligence capabilities. The corruption of royal household materials and the sophistication of the forged documents indicate state-level resources and planning.
Collins finished his security assessment and sat down across from Thomas. Mr. Mackenzie, I need to be direct with you about the situation. These people are not going to simply abandon their objectives because we've increased security around your family. They've invested too much in this operation to walk away empty-handed.
What are you saying?
I'm saying that they'll likely escalate their pressure until they either get what they want or we stop them permanently.
That could mean more direct threats against your family, attempts to kidnap you or your daughter, or even violence against the protective surveillance teams. The scope of the danger was becoming clear to Thomas.
His simple refusal to open a vault door had exposed an international conspiracy, with implications that reached far beyond his personal situation. Foreign governments were apparently willing to corrupt British institutions and threaten British citizens to gain access to whatever secrets the vault contained.
Detective Sergeant, what exactly is in that vault that would justify this level of effort? Collins was quiet for a moment, obviously weighing how much classified information he should share. Without going into specifics, I can tell you that the vault contains diplomatic correspondence and intelligence materials that could compromise ongoing operations in several regions of strategic importance.
If these materials fell into the wrong hands, they could destabilize alliances that have taken decades to build. The weight of responsibility Thomas felt was overwhelming.
His adherence to security protocol had prevented materials vital to national security and international stability from being compromised. But that same adherence had made him and his family targets for people with the resources and determination to threaten British citizens on British soil.
As if reading his thoughts, Collins continued, Mr.
Mackenzie, I want you to understand that your actions have potentially prevented a disaster that could have affected millions of people. The security protocols you followed exist precisely to prevent this kind of compromise, and your integrity in following them may have saved us from consequences we're only beginning to understand.
Before Thomas could respond, the sound of his mobile phone ringing filled the room. Collins immediately gestured for him to answer while pulling out his own device to begin recording the call.
Thomas Mackenzie speaking. Mr. Mackenzie, your hour is up. We trust you've made the right decision about cooperation. You'll find a car waiting outside your house in exactly 10 minutes.
Get in it alone, and you'll be taken to a location where we can discuss your future cooperation. Refuse, and your daughter will discover just how vulnerable university students can be. Thomas looked at Collins, who was nodding grimly while monitoring what appeared to be a tracking device. The detective sergeant held up a note that read, "We have teams moving toward the location now. I'll be there in 10 minutes, Thomas said into the phone.
Excellent. And Mr. Timagol.
Mackenzie, don't try anything heroic. We have people watching your house, your wife, and your daughter. Any attempt to involve law enforcement will result in immediate action against your family."
After ending the call, Collins looked at Thomas with professional concern. They don't know about our surveillance capabilities, which gives us an advantage.
But this is going to be dangerous for everyone involved.
Thomas realized that his ordeal was entering its final phase. The conspirators were forcing a confrontation that would determine not only his fate and his family's safety, but potentially the security of materials that could affect international relationships for years to come. As he prepared to leave his house and face whatever awaited him, Thomas thought about the oath he had taken 15 years earlier and the principles that had guided his simple life as a vault guardian. He had never expected that following those principles would require such courage, but he knew now that some things were worth any sacrifice to protect. The car that arrived was an unremarkable sedan with tinted windows, driven by a man who said nothing as Thomas got into the passenger seat. As they pulled away from his house, Thomas caught a glimpse of Detective Sergeant Collins, speaking urgently into his radio, while other surveillance vehicles began following at discreet distances. Whatever happened next would determine whether his silent defiance of illegitimate authority would ultimately protect or compromise the secrets he had sworn to guard. But Thomas knew that regardless of the outcome, he had chosen to act according to his principles rather than submit to threats and coercion. The final confrontation between his integrity and the forces that sought to corrupt it was about to begin.